Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our civic engagement with Nima Kulkarni. I really appreciate everyone being here. This is a really fascinating time for us as a country and as a nation and United States. And a lot of it is, geared around civic understanding, civic engagement, our government, how it works. And so Nima has been here. She's our representative she's a Kentucky State Representative for, I want to say, District 41. Does that sound about right, Nima?
40, very close.
40, I'm sorry. So for District 40, and she's also a Louisville Welcome Academy alumni. So she has given hours and hours back to the city of Louisville and a great partner for the Office for Globalization. And she came together with me and said, hey, I'd really love to do something around civic engagement and an educational opportunity. And again, being this fascinating time that we're living in right now, I thought, what a great idea. So I am going to take a moment to introduce two of our guests who are going to, one, present some information around civic engagement, and then also do some questioning. If I could please remind you all to add your thoughts, add your questions in the chat, make sure you're keeping yourself on mute, and we will get going. So we've got, I'm going to introduce Lena Muldoon first. Lena is a YPAL board member and the director of public issues for YPAL. And she is going to come on towards the end of our session where she'll moderate and do some questioning with Nima. And then Kentucky Representative Nima Kulkarni, as you know, is going to take it away from here.
Well, thank you all for having me, and thank you for participating in this. I think just as a sort of frame up for what we're trying to do, civic engagement and just really civic education in this country has been in decline for a long time. It is not consistent across states. It's not consistent even in Kentucky across school districts. And it's something that we all need to understand if we're going to be informed and engaged citizens. We only kind of get involved with politics, a lot of us, every 4 years when there's a presidential election. And there's a lot that goes on in between that time. And I think we need to understand, exactly how our government works, how our country functions, because it's a pretty interesting and amazing system that was set up, right, by our founding fathers. And if we don't understand how it works, it's easy for us to lose faith in our systems and for democracy and the ideals and the institutions of democracy to be eroded. And that is something that we owe it to ourselves as citizens of America to safeguard and to protect. And so that is why I'm very glad that Sabine allowed me to be a guest on here. I'm an attorney, so I apologize if this presentation is a bit dry. It's going to be a lot of nuts and bolts, but I'm hopeful for some discussion after, and certainly question and answer. And I'm also hopeful that this is not the end of the conversation, that we're able to reach different audiences, different groups, certainly younger folks who want to understand how everything works and how they can be more engaged. So that is why we're all here, and I'm happy to be here as well. Thank you. Do you want to get started right into the presentation? I'll let. So I just put together a couple slides, and well, several. And the main things that I wanted to categorize civics, my understanding of civics, into is the US government. So how is the government structured? How does it work? What are the branches? The census, which is incredibly important, and of course voting, which is also incredibly important, and how those three topics really tie in together as foundations for our democracy. So you can go on to the next slide. So we're going to first talk about the US government. It was ratified as a federal republic in 1789. That's when we actually ratified the Constitution with the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So that's where we established, of course, our three co-equal branches of government and everything that we're going to be talking about from here on in. If you want to go to the next slide. So this is a nice graphic that I got from, I believe it was USA.gov. And there's a lot of resources at whitehouse.gov, USA.gov. There's a constitutional governmental page, the National Archives. These are all really, really important online resources, digital resources that provide substantive information on everything you could possibly want to know in as much depth and detail as you want to go into. So if you have time and the inclination, there are good resources to just kind of explore our government and how it functions. There are, of course, three branches of the US government, legislative, executive, and judicial. I want to highlight, starting with the legislative branch, that it's made up of Congress, and the Congress is made up of two chambers. It's the Senate, which is a smaller upper chamber of the House, or the Congress, and the House of Representatives, which is a larger lower chamber of the House. And congressional elections occur every couple of years. So it's not, this is where I go back to, it's not just always about the presidential election every 4 years. Voters choose every House of Representatives member. So your representative in the House is elected every couple of years. The Senate is every 6 years. But it's really important to understand when election cycles are, who is running, because a lot of times you'll have folks that are retired or passed on that are no longer representing you. So they might call for a special election. You might have different times of the term when you're actually having to vote for who is representing you in Congress. Important to note that the Congress does not use the Electoral College. That is reserved for presidential and vice presidential elections. They use the popular vote for both the Senate and the House. It is important also to know what the requirements are. I think a senator, a U.S. senator, has to be at least 30 years old, a U.S. citizen for at least 9 years, and live in the state that he or she is going to represent. There's 100 senators. Each state gets 2. There's 50 states. And so we've got to, just like every other state in the union. Members of the House of Representatives, on the other hand, serve 2-year terms. There's 435 members of the House of Representatives. They get elected every midterm and every presidential year. So every couple of years they get reelected or elected for the first time. A representative in the U.S. House of Representatives has to be at least 25 years old, a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years, and also live in the state, obviously, that he or she is going to represent. This is important to note, this next point. The number of representatives a state has depends on its population. And so every representative in the U.S. House serves a specific congressional district, as opposed to the Senate, where every state gets 2, and that's it. I'm going to move on to the executive branch. I think we all know that's comprised of the president and the vice president, but also the cabinet, which are there's a lot of folks that serve as advisors and heads of different departments and agencies that are appointed by the president and the vice president. So that is what comprises the executive branch, which is charged with carrying out the laws that Congress makes, that the legislative branch makes. The judicial branch evaluates the laws. It is the highest court in the land. There are 9 justices, and including 1 chief justice. They are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. And they serve for life, so they do not have terms for justices. They either serve until their death, retirement, or removal, which I don't believe has ever happened in the history of this country. Real quick note, I want to go back to the Electoral College that I mentioned, which only applies to presidential and vice presidential elections. The Electoral College is a process and not a place. I think that's important for folks to understand. I know that in the past couple of election cycles, the Electoral College has loomed large, and folks have really started researching what it is because nobody really knew what it was. It's a fairly complicated system, and the point of it it's essentially a compromise that the founding fathers established in the Constitution between having the election of the president be decided by a vote in Congress versus a popular vote of qualified citizens. And so there are 538 electors. They're distributed among the states based, again, on population of the state. So right now there's 538, and a majority of 270 electoral votes is required to elect the president. Every state, so Kentucky, just like every other state, has the same number of electors that comprises the Electoral College as it does members in its congressional delegation. So there is one for every member in the House, plus 2 senators. And that is what makes up the Electoral College. And that's the role that they play in electing our president and vice president. You can go to the next slide. So this is a neat little map that I found that has the date that every state became a state. Kentucky, I believe, is 1791 or 2. And you know, we were talking right just a second ago about the federal government, but under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, any powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states and the people. So all state governments are modeled after the federal government, and they also have 2 branches, but that's not required. What is required is that there is still a system of checks and balances that essentially mirrors the federal system. You can go to the next slide. So this is essentially what a state government would look like. You also have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. The executive branch in states comprise of a governor, who is the head of the executive, and most states also have lieutenant governors, attorney generals, secretaries of state, auditors, and commissioners that are all elected as well. Legislative branch, obviously, I'm in the House. We also have a Senate. In Kentucky, you have 100 members of the state House and 38 members of the state Senate. And then you have a state Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the state, just like the Supreme Court is the highest court in the country. 50 states are made up, the legislature is made up of elected representatives. We consider laws brought by the governor or brought by our people. We look at budgets, we look at taxation, we look at potentially articles of impeachment, and I know that's been in the news, you know, this past year or so. That is all under the purview of state legislatures, and again, it fairly closely mirrors the federal system, you know, except for Nebraska. Everybody has a Senate and a House. Nebraska only has 1 legislative chamber, and that reflects the fact that while we're encouraged, state legislatures are encouraged to mirror checks and balances, there is no mandate that they have 3 co-equal branches of state government. So we can go on to the next. Just a quick note, sorry, it's a little bit different than the federal government. Every state House representative is similar to the U.S. House in that they serve 2-year terms, but senators serve 4-year terms versus the 6 years for a U.S. senator. All right, now next slide. Okay, the census. We just concluded the 2020 census. That's the decennial census. It occurs every 10 years. The census was established in the 1790 Census Act, and it is incredibly important because it essentially determines, based on population and household count, how much federal money is apportioned to the state and how it's distributed. It is also crucial in terms of fair representation because the number of representatives that we have in Congress, except for the Senate, so this is specific to the U.S. House of Representatives, is directly proportional to the count of the census every 10 years. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick little graphic that kind of illustrates what is the census for? Like, what is this money used for? Where does it go? The census itself, as we mentioned, was established by the Census Act. It's mandated in the Constitution, Article 1, and states that representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers. That is a lot packed into a very simple phrase. That is all the money and all of the representatives are all determined by the census. And it's also charged that the census will be conducted every 10-year term. I cannot overstate the importance of the census. It is consistently underreported. People don't want to report their households. They don't want to report who's in their household. And I want to make sure that folks understand that the 10-year census that occurs, that just occurred in 2020, for instance, is the most recent one. They're based on actual counts of people that are dwelling in the US. So if it's a residential structure and you're living in it, you should be counted in the census, in the 10-year census. That includes citizens, obviously. It includes also non-citizen legal residents. It includes non-citizen long-term visitors, and it includes undocumented immigrants. Anybody, even if they're a guest staying on your couch for a month, they should be counted in your household for the census. If you have an infant that was born the day before, that infant should be counted in the census. This is the only way that our federal government has any opportunity to understand who is living in which state and how much resources do they need. How many federal funds, how many federal programs, what is the allotment of money that they're going to get. And that in this past census was upwards of $1 trillion nationwide. And we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that go to over 300 federal programs, including healthcare, public schools, roads. It goes to your fire departments, your police departments. It is incredibly important that we are able to have a fair count to provide to the federal government so that our state gets our fair share. There was a controversy, certainly this past year, I'm sure everyone has heard, about the citizenship question on the decennial census. There is an American Community Survey that the Census Bureau conducts every year that has the citizenship question on it. So the American Community Survey is a far more detailed census form. The census that you took maybe in 2020, the 10-year census, is incredibly simple. All it's doing is asking for how many people are living in your house. It's not asking for names. It's not asking for any demographics. It's just trying to get a clear count of actual bodies that are in your residence. The American Community Survey does conduct the survey based on demographics, citizenship, how long you've been living in the US, age, gender, ethnic identity. All of those kinds of detailed questions are conducted every year in the American Community Survey. And that also goes towards determining, it helps the Census Bureau and the federal government understand who's living where, and which programs need maybe more support based on those demographics, on those more detailed demographics. 675 billion in state funds distributed every year is based on the American Community Survey. You can go to the next slide. Just a quick fact that I skipped over, Census Day has been conducted April 1st since 1930. That was delayed last year because of COVID. And so the count itself is going to be a little bit delayed. We would already have turned that into the government. They would already be sort of conducting whatever the necessary disbursements would be. This delay is particularly important because not only does the census determine how much money every state gets in what proportion, it also determines political representation, right? Elected positions, especially as we mentioned earlier to the US House of Representatives, but also in state legislatures where I serve. I serve in the state house. And redistricting is a legally required process that also occurs every 10 years based on that decennial census. And that's where the districts, right, for the US House, but also our state legislatures are drawn, redrawn, and changed. And, we have those figures from the census to allow us to do that. So that should have occurred in 2020. We would typically be gearing up for redistricting in 21. I believe that has been delayed to at least 2022 from what I understand because of the pandemic. And the slowdown in just getting the data from individuals that were not self-reporting. So you had folks that were calling you maybe or knocking on your door trying to figure out who lives where. which I know already engenders distrust in a lot of folks, but it's for a good reason. So if you did not provide any information in the 2020 census, I recommend that you try to do so in the American Community Survey that will be going out as well. A lot of states might gain seats, they might lose seats, they might keep seats the same number, but new districts are drawn to really mirror where the population is. So if there's more growth in a particular district, less growth in another district, those lines are going to be redrawn. And so the person serving that district, who has been elected to serve that district, may not be serving you anymore, depending on where these lines are drawn on a state level. And this is a process that also, for the past few years, has drawn a lot of scrutiny, legal and otherwise, public scrutiny, because of something called gerrymandering, which I'm not sure if folks have heard about. It's probably more popular in the past few years than it has ever before. It was coined in the early 1800s when a Massachusetts governor signed a redistricting bill, right? So this is a state legislature redistricting that included a district that looked like a salamander. And why would that occur? Why would you not just have squares or easily discernible districts based on population, if that's the purpose? It is politically susceptible, this redistricting process, because depending on who's in the majority, who's in the minority, people will legislatures, I say people, but state legislatures are in charge of this. And they can draw lines to cut out certain populations or to incorporate certain populations because that is what they anticipate the vote to be. So if you're a Republican led state legislature like we have, you might look at a district and say, okay, if we just add in this little neighborhood right here that votes predominantly Republican, and we incorporate it into a district that is trending purple or is turning red, the likelihood of a Democratic elected official in that district losing the next election will be increased. And that's essentially what gerrymandering is. It's been deemed unconstitutional in a lot of states, most famously North Carolina. And it's something that a lot of state legislatures, because of that, because they don't want it to be an unfair process, have appointed independent redistricting commissions. So it's not just whoever is in the majority that is controlling where the lines are drawn in terms of districts and who represents them. So it is, again, I cannot overstate the importance of being counted in the census, of paying attention to who is redistricting and how your redistricting maps are being drawn, because it is going to matter to you on a state and local level, including your cities and your counties, when it comes around to election time, which again is not every 4 years. You should be looking at every 2 years. You should also be looking at special elections, because it is incredibly important to you and your livelihood and your family, because they also determine where that federal money goes, right? So ultimately, all of that is determined by the census. If you want to go to the next slide, which leads us right into voting. The US has a system of one person, one vote. And just like the importance of the census, it is incredibly important to make your voice heard at the ballot box. If you want to go to the next slide. This is just a quick illustration of what the election process is. You have laws that are promulgated. You have voter registration. You have election day voting, whether it's absentee ballot, whether it is early voting, which we saw an expansion of this past year because of COVID. We had about 3 weeks of early in-person voting at a super center to make sure that it was safe for people to vote and that they were able to vote, regardless of when their work is or if their kids are at home. And one of the things that we have seen in the state legislature, in the House anyway, is House Bill 574, which sought to incorporate a lot of those expansions into law. So not just because of COVID, but in every election moving forward. Kentucky has one of the earliest poll closing times. It closes at 6 p.m. It's just us, and I think it's Indiana. Every other state has longer times to make sure that working parents and working families can go vote. Because if you get off work at 5 o'clock and you go, or maybe you don't, maybe you have to stay until 5:30, you're not going to make it until the polls close, especially if it all happens on one day, which is election day, and there might be lines. And so to alleviate some of that, because we saw a lot of success during COVID, during this last election cycle, we saw the highest turnout that we'd seen in years in the primary and in the general election, because we made voting easier for people, which meant a Saturday voting option, which meant more days to go vote, so everybody's not crammed into one day. And I think that all served the voters very, very well. And that's certainly in District 40. I know that the early in-person voting was a huge, huge help for parents and working families. So I'm hopeful that will pass this session. We only have 2 days left, but that is a very important bill that I wholeheartedly support. The elections clause in the Constitution is the primary source of the authority to regulate elections for the House of Representatives and the Senate. And it determines, it allows the states, to determine, quote, the time, place, and manner of elections. And so there's a lot of leeway given to, say, the Secretary of State, which is an elected position, and it's a state level position in 47 of 50 states. So it is in Kentucky, an elected state level position. The position itself does not exist in Alaska, Hawaii, and Utah. I am not sure what those states do because we are so used to in Kentucky having a Secretary of State that is primarily administrating elections. So what does that mean? You're talking about keeping state records from registering businesses, also making sure that votes are certified, voting procedures are promulgated, making sure they're consistent, ballots are consistent, everything that has to do with elections and a lot more services are under the purview of the Secretary of State. So it is a very important position, and it's elected. So it's also equally important that everybody understands who their Secretary of State is. If you want to go to the next slide. This is just a sort of wrap up of the voting situation. So presidential elections are held every 4 years. Everybody is very, very aware and made very, very aware of that election. It always has a higher turnout rate than midterm elections, which are every 2 years. So a term is 4 years, midterm every 2 years. In 2018, which was the last midterm that we had, 53% of our voting age population voted, which is the highest midterm turnout in 4 decades. In 4 decades, we got to 53%. That's a lot by our standards, but it's not great, right? And it's something, there's no reason why every eligible voter should not be trying really, really hard and making sure that they vote in every single election cycle. Midterms are often more, equally certainly, but often more important than voting in presidential elections, because in midterm elections, every single one of the 435 US House seats is on the ballot. About 1/3 of the US Senate seats are also elected during midterm elections. And those are only a tiny fraction. So congressional races are a tiny fraction of the total number of elected positions that voters are allowed to vote for in the midterms. At a state level, 37 governors, hundreds of state legislators. You also elect local officials like county executives, mayors, city and town councils. You also have attorney generals, treasurers, comptrollers, judges. And a lot of these folks will affect your day-to-day life far more than even a state level representative, and certainly more than a congressional representative. We're talking about your law enforcement, your firefighters, your trash collection, your potholes, your mail delivery in some level. But you need to make sure that you're aware and engaged and informed as a citizen of this country who's eligible to vote, to make sure that you do make your voice heard, because that's something that ties into the census, it ties into the structure of our government. And if we do not pay attention to every single facet of that institutional democracy, then we will lose our power as voters. And I think that we need to understand that on a real fundamental level. So I encourage everybody to use all of the resources that you have, right? We're in an unprecedented technological age, and I think it's incumbent on every eligible voter to be engaged, informed, and above all, make a plan to vote and go vote. That's the end of my Civics 101 presentation. It went kind of fast, maybe a little boring, but it's I think important for folks to understand. I mean, I learned stuff just putting it together in terms of some of the nuances of our system of government. But I'm happy to answer any questions, or we'll open it up to Lena and Sabine for discussion.
Thank you, Nima. Really, really appreciate that, and encourage participants to go ahead and add thoughts or questions you may have in the chat if you're watching. And I'm also going to take another opportunity to reintroduce Lena Muldoon, YPAL board member and director of public issues, as she's going to moderate some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Sabine.
Thanks.
Representative Kulkarni, that was an awesome 101. And I think you made a great point in that we never really stop learning about Civics 101 because there's so many aspects to it, but you bring a lot of great perspectives to it because you have so much knowledge in so many different areas. So I just really appreciate you bringing all of that to this table here. And helping us understand a little bit more, even if we're already very knowledgeable about different aspects. So just to kick us off with a general theme of a lot of what you were saying, if you could tell someone who is brand new to civic engagement, the first step to take to get involved in having their voice heard or in taking action, what would that first step be in your opinion?
Register to vote. If you've just moved, even if you're, if you've moved to this country, you've just moved to a different state, make sure that your registration is updated and current. Even if you've just moved houses, make sure that you're able to get, because that is the first thing and the most fundamental building block of our democracy. I would say educate yourself in terms of who your council member is in wherever you've moved. Your local electeds, I would say, make sure your council member and your state representative, your state senator, get a library card and utilize the library. I know they've been kind of closed to the public this past year, but there's a lot of information that you get from your community libraries. But fundamentally, I would say register to vote and just learn who your representatives are. That way, a lot of times that leads, one thing leads to another because we'll have, for instance, town halls or we'll be at neighborhood association meetings. And that will get you more information about what are the issues impacting your neighborhood, your community, and you'll learn a lot more about your neighbors and their concerns as well.
Could not agree more. It's wonderful first steps. So Kentucky has a really great grassroots voter mobilization system and effort statewide in Louisville, but we still struggle with voter turnout, which you touched on very well. So where do you think that the real problem lies there, or that we can start to get to the root of that issue?
That's, a lot of it, I mean, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, it's pretty deliberate effort on the part of a lot of different organizations or just, I don't even know. It's a concerted effort by some people or some organizations to disillusion voters, to make them think their vote doesn't count, to make them think that both political parties are the same, and that every politician is the same and out to just serve themselves, and that it's a corrupt system, and that democracy doesn't work. Fundamentally, that's what's been going on, and there are, I mean, at this point, probably trillions of dollars over however many years, decades, that have been put into this. And we've saw so much rhetoric about this last election, where it was all fake. Everything was fixed. Your vote doesn't count. It was stolen. And this was parroted by high level, right? A high level high levels in our government. And it's difficult, I think, for voters to understand who to trust and who not to trust, because you trust elected officials, right, to know this stuff. And you would say, well, this is somebody who is a very high level public official. Of course, they know what they're talking about. I can't trust this vote. I can't go to my polling station, or I can't believe anything this person tells me. I think that we have to fight back against that. And the only way to fight back against that is by voting. There is so much money put into voter suppression. There's so much money put into voter misinformation, misdirection, and disillusionment that I think we need to just really wake up and not give into that and not play into that, and really just take it upon yourself to inform yourself and vote. There are plenty of resources. Certainly every candidate is going to try to reach you in a multitude of ways, but just learn about what issues affect you and your schools and your libraries and your safety of your community, and focus on those issues, and listen to who is speaking to those issues, and just vote. That's the only way we're going to be able to counteract that narrative.
Well, this is a great follow-up question to your first two answers. Do you know of a good resource or go-to sort of consolidated place where voters can learn about candidates or platforms in a very, easy sort of way, digestible way?
Well, I know that there are places like, like Ballotpedia, and there are different websites that have popped up for this, right? Just for this purpose. But a lot of it is going to be, you're going to get phone calls and you're going to get mail from candidates that are, that you can vote for, right? And so what I would suggest is just pay attention to what you get, what contact is made by which candidates, and follow that race. The Secretary of State will have county by county election data. Who is running? What are they running for? And then you can just follow that trail. They'll have their contact information, their website, and you should reach out to those folks. So, probably the most bare bones information you'll get is from the Secretary of State's office. Like, here's this person, they're running for this office. And then you can try to figure out from their website or from other sources where they stand and what they're for. But I think that's a good place to start, just to recognize and identify who's running for what in your community.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that a lot of people don't know that you're getting at, is that a lot of these local elections, the representatives and the candidates are very accessible. You can
Yeah.
very much reach out to them and make contact. So that's wonderful. So what do you think, and you probably already touched on this, but if you want to expand or bring another item into it, what do you think is the biggest challenge for or threat to civic engagement in Kentucky today?
I think certainly access to the polls. If if we increase the time and the days that people can go vote, that has a huge impact on the turnout and the number of eligible voters who can vote. I think that we just need to make sure that we talk about it more. I mean, it seems like we talk about voting and elections during an election cycle, and everybody gets really sick and tired pretty easily and early on from just the constant and relentless communication that you get from candidates, but then you don't really hear from them on that level. And I think that what we need to do is have consistent contact with voters, not just voters that we know always vote, but new voters, folks that are newly naturalized citizens that have moved into your district, your community. There's consistently low turnout among Black and Brown voters. A lot of women who are caretakers and can't get to the polls, and it's not their priority. We need to make sure that our schools, and that means our like elementary schools, middle schools, our high schools, not just college campuses, that they know about voting and what it is and how our country works and what democracy means, so that when they turn 18, they go vote, and I think, I saw a lot of parents bringing their kids just to the polling location, just so they could see. And I've heard that it's a tradition for a lot of parents, just so they get used to going there and they understand how important it is. Those kinds of things, I think, are really, really important for the next generation. And I'm really going to be pushing hard to reincorporate civics education in our schools at a younger age, so that folks get used to talking about this and having discussions about this on a very informed level.
I absolutely agree. And I love seeing children at polling locations. It warms my heart. So in the chat, we've got, what advice around being informed about their representatives and candidate platforms would you give to new Americans who have limited English proficiency?
That is a problem. Yeah. You know, as somebody who has run a couple of campaigns, it is difficult because there is always a time crunch. So there's and money, right? So when you talk about where does all the money go, why are people raising all this money for campaigns, campaign finance, and we spent so much money on the presidential election. On a state level, state and local level, it goes to direct voter contact. But that doesn't necessarily mean in every language and to every voter. So it is an unfortunate byproduct of the way of our two-party system, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think there should be way more than two parties. I think there are a lot of issues that come up in terms of voter disengagement because of a two-party system, and people don't feel represented enough. That's a separate conversation. Sorry, went off on a tangent. But it is going to be incumbent on candidates to do that. And I think the more that people get used to using social media, digital platforms, the easier it will be. Certainly, you know, on my website, for instance, I can include a language translator. But it is really, really important for folks to recognize that. And in Kentucky, it's a problem because immigrants and new Americans don't necessarily make up a big chunk of the voting populace of folks that candidates recognize and parties recognize as being folks that go to the polls, right? That's bottom line. They're like, who's going to show up on election day, who's consistently voted, and that's who you target. And so it is something that's a problem because we as new Americans don't necessarily exercise our political presence enough to get on the radar of these sort of giant national political parties radar. So I think that we need to do our part to make sure that we vote, that we show that we're a voting bloc, and that's true of different communities throughout Kentucky, throughout this nation. And I think it's happening. It's happening more recently. But that's the only way folks will pay attention. Otherwise, it's kind of up to us and our communities to make sure that we help our friends and neighbors who maybe are of limited English proficiency understand and vote. You know, make sure that they understand how it is, because certainly with things like absentee ballots, it's a confusing process. I filled out an absentee ballot last year, and it was not easy. I speak English. You know, I'm used to this. I educated myself. I watched videos, and I still, you know, I almost sent it off without a signature. And that happens. That happens all the time. And so think about how often it would happen for somebody who there are additional barriers to that. So I think it's incumbent on ourselves, on new Americans and immigrant communities, to help each other out and organize ourselves and make sure that we take this political process in hand so we can impact it the way that we definitely can, and we're not doing at this point in time.
Absolutely. Well, keeping up with this theme of engagement with local politics, what relationship do Metro Council members here in Louisville have to the state legislature?
Yeah, so I know I speak to my Metro Council folks that in my district a lot. I try to. We just got done with session, so it was a little bit more hectic, but I try to keep tabs, even if I'm not directly involved, on things like traffic lights, on things that are, you know, that impact safety in communities, certainly roads and highways. this last year with regard to law enforcement and the protests for justice for Breonna Taylor. You know, I try to be involved on a very, very local level, even though the laws I make may not necessarily always impact on a Metro Council level. I mean, with Breonna's law, it did, because I was on a working group, and it resulted in an ordinance to ban no-knock warrants, which was also filed in the state by Representative Attica Scott. But that doesn't always happen. You know, it doesn't always dovetail where there's a state level and a local level policy that mirror each other, that everyone's working on. But I do try to make sure I contact them, and I go to neighborhood association meetings as well, to understand what is happening on a local level. So I think that it should be a very close relationship. It helps me do my job better if I know all the issues that are occurring in every part of my district, in every community, every neighborhood. And so I try to do that. It's not necessarily consistent with every state level representative. And I know senators, for instance, have a much larger number of people. Like House districts are around 40 to 42,000 people. State senators have a much larger district, so it's difficult for them to you know, be aware of every little thing. And in that situation, also Metro Council members are very useful in notifying them, alerting them, keeping them in the loop of certain circumstances that are occurring. So I think it's important. I'm sure that there are many, many other legislators, representatives, and senators that would agree with me, because I think we're all there to serve our communities. So it helps to collaborate to do that.
Well said. Well, you spoke about redistricting earlier, and I'm really glad you mentioned that. What should we expect from that upcoming conversation? I know it will probably begin soon in terms of just discussing it, and how can or should we as citizens or constituents or residents be a part of that conversation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because this is not a process that is a public and transparent process. Not necessarily. I mean, it is up to the states, and communities to decide that, how they want to do it. A lot of times we've seen in the past few election cycles, it's sort of done in a closed room with a few people, and then they come out with a map, and this is now the map. And you know, it's based on whatever political or demographic reasons that they prioritize. You know, I would hope that Kentucky goes the route of establishing an independent redistricting commission. It is not required to be public, that whole process, but at least it's independent, and so it's not driven entirely by political motivations. So that, I think, is public as possible. For our own sake, so that our voters know that we're trying to be accountable and responsible, and open about how this is all playing out, and that we're fair to all of the voters that live in each of our districts. So I think that's one thing I'm hopeful for. We have not gotten there yet, because you know, everything was delayed because of the census due to the pandemic, but it's coming up soon. And it's something that I think a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle, I mean, this is not necessarily a partisan issue, would like to see an independent commission, because we need to get back to a level of faith and trust in our systems of democracy, and that's one way to do it.
Lots more to see there. Well, Representative Kulkarni, this has been an absolute being.
I think she's frozen.
Thank you, Lena. And I think you froze a little bit there. So what I believe Lena was saying is that it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Nima. This has been great. It's been an honor. And Lena, thank you for participating with us as well. And those questions were great. And I want to remind everybody that this is a series. So this is just the first of a series of virtual exchanges that we're going to have with Nima Kulkarni, and we're going to talk about other things in a little bit more detail. Our next virtual exchange is scheduled for April 16th at 12:30, so we hope you'll join us then. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nima. Thank you, Lena. Really appreciate everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.